incredible speakers that are going to bring some insight and information that is very relevant to the boardroom and things that we should all be considering. We also really enjoy a very interactive session, so appreciate everyone if they have their video on or want to ask questions as we go. We'll be monitoring the chat room. So with that, I won't take up any more time, and I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker that's going to kick it off, which is Sarah Turner. And then also we have Joe Allen. So thank you very much for being here, and we'll just go ahead and get started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kim. Thanks everybody for inviting us today. It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially to be talking with all of you, as well as Dr. Joe Allen. We have a few questions that we want to ask, some important topics around the vaccines, the Delta variant, and around the controls in the workplace. But before we get started, maybe we can just kind of reflect on the journey that we've been through in the past 18 months. So since March of 2020, if you recall, we did all really well going remotely working very quickly, and organizations found great ways to be productive and effective and supportive of employees as we went through the next few months. And as you might recall, we then thought, oh, we're going to go back to normal in a few months. And by July of 2020, so Labor Day weekend, we're saying, yeah, we'll all be back in the office. And then I was like, well, no, not really. Let's go to Labor Day weekend. And then it started to be pushed back even further. And though, having said that, some organizations started to go back into the workplace, albeit with limited capacity, as we monitored the cases of COVID over time. And then in December, January, and February, vaccines became available, and more organizations started to think about going back into the workplace, albeit with a more flexible kind of hybrid working. And that's what we're seeing a lot of now, is what does this sustained or remote working mean in terms of a hybrid model going forward? And then, of course, now we have the variant has risen, and whilst it's been one of the many variants over the last 18 months, this one is much more transmissible and has caused much concern for organizations and employees that hopefully we can address today. So with that, for now, let me pause, and I'll turn it over for a minute or two for Dr. Joe Allen to introduce himself and get it started. So please say hello and share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Great to join you. I've been working with EY since the beginning of the pandemic, from the early days and every day since. And thanks to Kim and Lisa for the invitation, and hope to be a resource to everybody and have a nice conversation here. Quick background: I'm a professor at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I direct their Healthy Buildings program. My background is in exposure and risk science. I'm part of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, working with international experts on this global response. And within the Lancet Commission, I chair their task force on safe work, safe school, and safe travel. So I've been advising many top leaders like yourselves for the past 18 months across almost every sector of the economy: hospitality, entertainment, K through 12 schools, universities, corporate real estate, technology, biotech, pharma, you name it. Really around all these same questions that Sarah mentioned, and kind of this journey we've been on. Every time we think we have it figured out, this virus throws us another curveball. I happen to think the past month might have been the most confusing for companies of the past 18 months. I think there's a lot of information out there. Do the vaccines work? Do people transmit the same? What about Delta? What about these new variants? What about boosters? What are the control strategies that need to be in place? What about kids in schools? So each new day seems to bring a new curve. Each new day brings some new scientific finding that we have to incorporate into everything we've known in the past, not throw away what we've learned, and hopefully provide guidance, not hopefully, but provide guidance based on the latest scientific evidence. So looking forward to the conversation, happy to take this anyway. And I get maybe one last thing. I know we all share the interest in not just COVID, but what are the strategies we put in place that lead to better resiliency against whatever comes next, and not just thinking about infectious diseases. What else can we do in our organizations? So pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. So maybe to get us started, if I can ask you, with the rise in the variant, what are organizations doing now? Obviously, over time, they've been looking at keeping employees safe, but what are they doing now to keep employees safe? And what are employees doing themselves in terms of managing their own safety in the workplace?
Yeah, I think the last part of that question should be the easiest. Everyone needs to get vaccinated. I'm a big proponent of vaccine mandates. This is the path out of this. They're safe, they're highly effective. That's our long-term big picture strategy here. We can talk about the other controls employees can do. In terms of what can companies do, I think everyone has to recognize that this is an airborne virus. That seems obvious, but it was not accepted for over a year by CDC, and even the World Health Organization hedges on this. We've been working with EY since day one. This is an airborne virus. I wrote a piece in February 2020 calling this. That is important because then that determines what controls flow from that. So what you can do as an organization, outside of the things you've heard about with masking, vaccines, the buildings are key. So think about this just quickly. When we talk, breathe, sing, we're generating respiratory aerosols. If you're infectious, they will carry the virus. They will build up indoors in an underventilated space. In fact, they will travel beyond 6 feet. They'll accumulate until they're removed through one of two ways. They're brought out of the building through ventilation, or they're cleaned out of the air through filtration. So a lot of companies have gotten their act together on ventilation and filtration enhancements. But I say there's still companies right now I work with and advise that have just come on board that are just getting a handle on this. So it's better late than never. But as they think about the return to work, it's been pushed off a little bit through the fall. Maybe some firms think about the winter. There's still a lot of time to get your ventilation and filtration game in place. So I'll stop there. That's a lot, but I think that's absolutely key for organizations to take care of.
Mm-hmm. And Joe, I know you had mentioned when we talked earlier around employees and what they were doing to manage their own kind of monitoring of the ventilation. Is that something that organizations should be concerned about?
Well, absolutely. I think organizations not only have to put in these improvements, but you need to verify the performance. That's obvious. But how do you do it? And you can use real-time sensors to do this. And I'll tie it into your question, Sarah, because I think it's really sharp. That if you're not doing this, your employees will be doing it. And I'll give you an example. I am measuring carbon dioxide on my desk right now. That is way too high. I would never have people over here. 2,000 parts per million of CO2 is too high. I'm going to pop up my window, but it's very humid out today. There are tools available. This doesn't cost a couple $100. And if you've seen what's happening in social media, a lot of people are using these and shaming organizations. Hey, Delta, I'm on your plane. It's 2,000 parts per million. I've heard from Professor Allen, that's not safe. Hey, so-and-so store, I'm in your store. Look what's happening. So it's flipped, right? It's a citizen science moment. A lot of people are monitoring CO2 as a proxy for ventilation rate. And so I think it's a smart move for organizations to think about or to deploy a real-time monitoring network so that you can not control the data, but you can be on top of it. You're presented with something, you can combat it. Well, people are misusing these things all the time. I can game this thing, I can blow into it and I get this thing up way too high. And so you can actually control the data in a good way and then control the messaging. And importantly, most importantly, be reassured that what you're doing is working. I just set up a monitoring campaign yesterday at a major university with sensors from my own lab to monitor classroom carbon dioxide concentrations. Wouldn't you know it? One of the classrooms, we found something was wrong. CO2 was too high. Quick correct, got the CO2 down, everybody's safer in the building, but no one would know it without the monitoring.
Great, great. Well, I do want to open it up for questions because I'd love to hear the things that are top of mind for the audience here. So I don't know if there's anybody who's got a burning question that they'd like to ask now. There's many icons on the screen right now, so it's difficult to see everybody. I'm not sure if we're seeing everybody, but if you can unmute yourselves. I don't know, Lisa, can people unmute themselves?
So,
David,
yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Allen, what should the carbon dioxide measure be to be deemed safe? What's the range?
Yeah, it's a great question, smart question. Always have to set a target. And I'll explain it just a little bit that the current standards that are set for buildings are minimum standards not designed for infection control. And if you're meeting those, it'll be about 1,000 parts per million. So most offices, you see about 1,000 parts per million. Most schools, 1,500 parts per million. On an airplane, I've measured it over 2,000 parts per million. My office, way too high. So that's been the rule of thumb. That's not enough. The current rule of thumb I've seen out there, and I've derived this from some of the work we've done, under 800 parts per million would be good. But there's a major caveat if we're going to get into the details of sensing. Remember, as these aerosols, respiratory aerosols build up in the room, you have two mechanisms, ventilation or cleaning out of the air through filtration. The CO2 is telling you ventilation. And because filters don't capture CO2, most filters don't capture CO2, you could have a condition where you had high CO2, but people were still protected because your filtration game is great. So it's not an absolute. There's nuance here, but a rule of thumb is you want to look for probably under 800 parts per million. Under 1,000 prior to COVID had been the rule of thumb that a lot of people in my field used.
I have a question in terms of, as directors on boards, obviously we're always looking at not only what we need to do that makes sense and is just good citizenship. What do you see in terms of regulation that might be coming down regarding buildings or just in general? I don't know if that's an area that you're involved in, Dr. Allen, but I'm curious, as directors, is there things we should be looking for? Heads up. You're talking about employees doing these monitoring, but what can we do to be proactive as a board and as a leadership team?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kim. Couple things. One, I think the regulatory process is going to get there, and the standard setting body for things like our buildings called ASHRAE, or standard setting organization, non-governmental. And I talked to the chair of this just earlier this week, the chair of the group that manages this standard, and they're convening a group to reevaluate this ventilation standard for buildings in light of COVID. It will be lowered eventually. They're a slow moving body. I don't think it's going to happen next month, maybe not even this year, but eventually it'll catch up. I think the movement, though, this healthy buildings movement we're in, as I call it, is pulling way ahead because of the expectations of all of your employees and people in your companies, right? That this is the new minimum. Who's going to go into a building that's not healthy? You want a healthy building, how do you verify it? So to be proactive, I think it's smart to start thinking about what your monitoring program looks like in your buildings. Who is doing it? Do you have the technology in place? Even if you're not doing it today, guaranteed these things are going to proliferate, right? You'll be doing this on your phone not too far off. So this future merging of smart buildings and healthy buildings is here to stay. Whether you do it this year or next year, you'll be doing it eventually in your companies. Here's something really important for board members, though, and directors to think about. Do you have the expertise in the company to deal with that data? Because it's now essentially health data. So many times this kind of monitoring data was energy data over the past 20 years, goes to facilities, maybe a sustainability manager, they can manage energy data fine. If they screw up the energy data, that's bad, but no one dies or gets sick in your building. If that's where the data are flowing, they have to have people in your organization who have that training, the health-based training, to know what to do with that data, to know when to sound the alarm, hey, there's a big problem here, or when it's acceptable and okay. I've been talking with a lot of companies. That's an area they're really taking seriously, because now you're generating data. If no one's looking at it, presents a future liability, can be discovered, it's discoverable for a toxic tort claim. So that's, I think, a really key area. Is who's not, if you collected data, who is monitoring it in your organization?
That actually was going to be my question, because it's fine when you're talking one building in the US, but when you're talking hundreds of buildings in multiple countries, are you opening a can of worms here? This sounds like you may be standing up an entirely new department. Is that something you're seeing? And then a follow-on, would you mind placing the name of that regulatory body or that advisory body in the chat, or sharing it in some way? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Great comment, Andre. And so first part of that, thinking about, the companies I work with, multinationals dealing with hundreds of buildings. I don't know if they're necessarily standing up a new group, but several are typically, this has come into environmental health and safety, maybe, which mostly looked at, OSHA violations, and many EH&S groups haven't been that down that path of the real-time monitor, the big data space. So some of these big companies are rethinking their environmental health and safety strategy to be a bit more sophisticated for what's obviously coming. So I'd say that's the approach, but you're right, it's a big endeavor. And so some of them are starting, like anything else, a pilot, starting small, couple sensors, deploy it in one building, get a feel for what your plan and approach is going to be. There's not a clear roadmap out there that you can just plug and play and say, we're going to follow that right now. So it's a little open. And I'll pop in the name in the chat here, that standard setting body.
And interestingly, Joe, I think that what we're also seeing with organizations is there is obviously the health and safety aspect, but it's very strongly now linked to the hybrid model. So are we reconfiguring our workplaces? Are we going to a flexible work model? What technologies do we need to support in terms of a hybrid model? And so how are we looking at very much holistically? So we've definitely seen organizations that have just focused on one topic, but those organizations that are thinking about it more holistically are really thinking more longer term of how are we going to sustain managing and monitoring not only safety but the employee experience, the real estate footprint, the configuration of the office. So I'm hearing much more about organizations saying it's about purpose, not presence in the office now, because employees are demanding a more flexible, and it's not just where they work but when they work, a working arrangement. Luann, I see you're off mute.
Yes, actually, you kind of touched on my question a little bit, because I was going to ask, given that ASHRAE, you said, is kind of now just kind of getting into it and looking at changes or recommendations. Are there any other regulatory agencies that you know of, given your global purview, that are maybe further along or more mature that you could point to in terms of how they're looking in terms of regulating or recommendations?
Yeah, unfortunately, there aren't many. Let's say in the US, I don't think you're going to get anything from OSHA, NIOSH, or there was an emergency standard they were supposed to pass in March, and the deadline passed and they just didn't do it. So I don't see that coming. I think Europe is generally ahead of us on this topic of kind of healthy buildings and higher ventilation rates. And I think one of the challenges for companies as you start to think about better indoor air quality, better ventilation, is the higher energy costs that come with that. And then sometimes, if not done well, it starts to come in conflict with your ESG, climate, sustainability goals. And there's a tension there. Hey, I'm going to spend more energy to improve air quality, bring in more outdoor air, better filters. Oh, now I have an energy penalty. Now it's going to hit my carbon budget. It's going to hit my ESG goals. How do you marry those so it's not an either or, right? Can't have energy efficiency at the expense of everybody's health inside the building. Can't have everybody's health at the expense of climate and the environment outside the building. So that's a tension point that I think a lot of these organizations are maybe stuck on a bit in terms of why they're not moving more aggressively.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm trying to look to see if I can see unmuted people, or please feel free to put them in the chat. So maybe whilst you're thinking about that, when we think about the longer term outlook, given the Delta variant, what's your view on the impact of the boosters? Like how will that kind of translate over the coming months, maybe years?
Yeah, I think we'll see what the Biden announcement today, the latest 6-point plan will be. I suspect it'll be a heavy focus on boosters. I think the science there is really mixed, and I think scientists are really are all over the map on whether it's supported or not. I mean, the idea of, so it really depends on what our goals are. If we take a step back, the vaccines are highly effective at preventing severe disease and death. No absolutes, nothing's perfect. That has not changed over time. With Delta, there's been some drop in effectiveness of getting any COVID. And most of the times it's asymptomatic or mild. Some of these breakthroughs can lead to severe disease, but for the most part, they're still very protective in that regard. What the boosters do is give you an antibody boost. So quick, dive into what happens in your immune system. You get vaccinated, you get a big antibody response, and then that wanes over time, all the time. And then your immune system retains a memory through B cells and T cells. And then if you're exposed later, the virus may start to replicate in your nose, your immune system ramps up and deals with the infection. antibodies, if you have high levels of antibodies at the time, we'll get it quicker. And the idea of the boosters is, well, you give your body this boost, your immune system this boost of antibodies, and then it lowers the likelihood of having any breakthrough infection. So many countries are not moving in that direction for boosters. I think the US will. I think it's I think it's really smart if you're older or immune compromised to get a booster. It's not clear that the vast majority of the US will need a booster. I do think it will help in terms of helping to further drop cases lower, but it won't have that big of an impact on hospitalizations and deaths. And it doesn't address the bigger problem. It's not so much the vaccinated anymore that is the problem, it's the unvaccinated. That's still where our problem is. And so things aren't going to change all that much if we start getting a third dose to people who are already vaccinated, and in large part, many people who are vaccinated have taken more protections, taken other steps. So it feels a little misguided in my view, and considering that some parts of the world, Africa, only a small percent are vaccinated. This virus is a global problem, doesn't stop at our borders. We need to vaccinate the world. So if any of this is slowing down that movement, that's a big problem. We're not going to be out of this until the world is vaccinated.
So that sounds like a much longer duration than a couple of months after March 2020 in terms of dealing with this.
Yeah, this virus is endemic at this point. I don't think zero COVID is feasible. It probably wasn't ever feasible. Even the countries that pursued zero COVID successfully, Australia, New Zealand, a couple other countries, Australia, they're really struggling at this point. You start to get cases, they've had pretty strict lockdowns. They still are going to require vaccines. Now, as soon as any kind of hole pops through the zero COVID approach, you're going to have widespread cases. Delta burns through a population very quickly, and it will quickly become uncontrollable. Now you have a very small percent vaccinated and a very small portion of your population with natural infection. There's lots of susceptible people. It's a real challenge. So really, this is why the path out of this ultimately is vaccines.
So just quickly following on from that, I see a question in the chat that they've read that the potential, obviously we've read around the potential upside of the booster, but is there a downside to it?
I mean, not really, other than if it's potentially keeping doses from other countries. But in terms of downside, in terms of safety, it looks like the safety profile is fine. You would get a boost from it. And that's why I think in the US it'll happen. I think a lot of people probably everybody wants the best protection. I think it gives a little extra protection from getting any breakthrough case. So there's really no downside other than, do we really need this? World Health Organization has called for the high income countries to pause on booster shots before many healthcare workers around the world haven't even had one shot. So it comes down to that, really. And it's not about, protecting ourselves in the US. We need to vaccinate the world. So selfishly, we need to do that. It's the right thing to do, I believe. I'm a professor of public health, but also it's selfishly the right thing to do to protect the US.
Yeah, I'm just looking at a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to combine the two. Are there any brands of CO2 monitors that you recommend, and how valuable is the reduced density of people in, I'm presuming that's reduced density of employees in the offices?
Yeah, two good questions. So I generally shy away from endorsing brands, but I'll tell you the two I have. So if you're looking for like a personal monitor, I kind of like this one. I showed it on CNN. They sold out after I showed it. Aranet 4, we can put it in the chat. It's pretty cheap, easy to use. And it's reliable. My Harvard team likes these AWAIR sensors, AWAIR, distributed network. And then if you're looking for something more sophisticated, and full disclosure, I'm a strategic advisor to Carrier Corporation, and I'd help them develop this platform. It's called Abound, and that's a more sophisticated, if you want a monitoring system that's integrated in the building, connected to the building management system, so a bigger lift. It's not like one of these that you carry around. So I think, if you're looking for something personal, you want to get a sense of what's going, the Aranet 4 is great, really simple to use. And then there's a couple of these other platforms out there that are more, are you really going to set up a system in your building?
One question that came through, and I know you'll know a lot about this because I know we've been working very closely with you from an EY perspective, is around metrics that companies are monitoring to minimize infection or track and trace the illness in employees? And what are those metrics that you would recommend that organizations should be looking at?
Yeah, so I see the comment there. It's really good. And I know I'm a friend of Ashish Jha, who led that Harvard Global Health first report on what metrics, and it largely defined how we approach the first year. Case metrics, positivity. And if you look at what CDC is doing, those are the two metrics they're using right now. You've probably seen a map of the US that's all red at this point. Everyone's in a high spread area. They're using two metrics. One is cases per 100,000 people over 7 days. And the other is percent positivity. How many tests are showing positive? I think those were useful metrics last year pre-vaccines, but I don't think they're useful anymore. I'm actually working on a piece with a colleague critiquing these a bit for this reason. Cases matter a lot for people who are unvaccinated and in low vaccinated parts of the world or states like we saw in the South. It's going to matter less in high vaccinated countries and regions like the Northeast US, because cases will decouple. The vaccines allow the decoupling of cases from hospitalizations and deaths. So if we're tracking cases, I personally don't think it's the metric that tells us about risk, the risk of your building, the risk of spread. I mean, it's spread, but it's not having a public health impact. Hospitals aren't being overwhelmed. In low vaccinated areas, yes, that's what will happen. So those metrics are still good. I think the better metric right now to be tracking are hospitalizations and deaths. The downside there, of course, is that it's a lagging metric. Hospitalizations lag cases by 3 weeks or so. But it's going to be more stable and more reliable. The test positivity metric that everybody liked for a while, New York City mayor was setting these standards, 3% positivity, 5%, 15%. I think that's a useless metric at this point. Who gets tested? Well, if you're sick, you go get tested. If you're sick, really sick, you definitely get tested when you're at the hospital. Wealthy people get tested because some of these tests can cost over $100 and it's an access issue. And a lot of people now are using rapid tests. If you test positive on a rapid test, you usually get a confirmatory test. You show up in the formal count. I've used rapid tests that are negative. That doesn't appear in any official count. So it's impacting the denominator there. And it's throwing these positivity numbers all over the map because it's not a metric that's, that's capturing everybody. It's missing a lot of people. So it's biased in that sense. So I think it's not a useful metric at this point. A lot of people I think it was good in the early days. It told us if we were doing enough testing or not, but people have started to use it as a risk metric. Personally, I don't think it's that good. What you need to know is that CDC, ever since Rochelle Walensky came in, I worked with her prior to her appointment in the Biden administration. Those are the two metrics she used from day one. So I don't think CDC is going to pull away from it, even though I believe, and many of my colleagues believe, they're problematic.
And following on from that, then one question came through around the thoughts on the board's role in advocating, and I'll just add in the metrics piece, but advocating for monitoring, the management approach to testing and vaccinations, and are there risks in terms of the board not pushing best practices?
I think for sure there are risks. I've been contacted many times already by plaintiffs' attorneys. The plaintiffs' bar is active. I think there's lawsuits that are going to be happening. I think it comes down to lawsuits around illness or injury. There are lawsuits around, if you're a building owner, do you provide a safe building? If you're a tenant, how is that happening? Are you impacting other tenants? So this stuff is flying around right now. And absolutely, it's following what the official guidance is, but also what best practice is. And it's across all these dimensions: vaccinations, healthy building strategies, masking. What else are you doing in terms of surface? Well, hand hygiene and surface cleaning, I think, finally has met its rightful fate. That we've been overdoing it for a year. But all those factors will come into the evaluation of, are you following best practice? Yeah.
There was a question about the density of folks inside the building in the chat earlier. And that's an area that I think has been really interesting in the boardroom, because we're looking at, returning people to work, but how do they return to work? And what do we do to keep folks from going back to the habits that they had when, I know I worked at HP for 30 years, and it was all about how can we pack more people in, and then eventually, the tides change and you change how are you doing. But I think with COVID and with all the considerations with return to work, those designs and those workspaces. So I'd be curious, along with the person that posed the question, on what trends and what considerations the board should have in terms of workspace and density, and I wonder also if there will be eventually regulation on that as well.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and obviously important. So distance matters. I think that's obvious. One way to think about the transmission factor is cigarette smoke. It's a nice way to visualize. If I'm smoking a cigarette, you're 2 feet from me, you're going to get a big blast. If you're 6 feet, a little bit less. If you're in a well-ventilated space or outdoors, you may not even notice I'm smoking at 10 feet away, right? So that's one way to visualize it. That said, I think it's a mistake to look at these different control strategies in isolation. When the other control strategies are in place, if you have a high percent of your people vaccinated, if you have good ventilation and filtration, distancing becomes less important. And what I've seen over the past year is that many organizations and even schools have started to pull back from the strict 6-foot distancing. I'm seeing a lot less of the tape everywhere. Everybody, measured off 6 feet at all times, one-way directional movement. I think that's done. I think rightly so. And it's based on the science. If you look at the meta-analyses that are done, when baseline risk is low, distance becomes much less important. So what defines baseline risk being low? Amount of community spread, what are the controls in your building, what percent of your people are vaccinated. And so I'd say most organizations I work with are no longer following any kind of distancing rules. This is everything from Broadway. They're going shoulder to shoulder. I've done performing arts all summer, touring concerts, TV shows we've advised. They're all shoulder to shoulder against schools, no distancing requirements. And most offices, airplanes, right, no distancing. So they've removed the middle seat thing that they did for a little bit. So anyway, I think that's consistent with how organizations are approaching it, but it's if you have those other controls in place.
And Kim, I'd like to add to that, there's the distancing piece, but the experience of going back into the office is actually, we're hearing much more that it's actually worse than it was pre-pandemic, even though the offices have kind of, they've remained static, but there are certain things that organizations, you no longer have, let's say, accessibility to the coffee machine, or there's, certain, you have to wear a mask in the office, and employees have made their homes much more comfortable. Not everybody, I get it. Some people don't have the space to do that. And so this is becoming much more of a focus in terms of talent attraction and retention, and organizations are looking at kind of thinking, what have we learned that employees have really benefited from? There are things that we're still learning from a remote perspective that actually is beneficial. I now can see everybody's face and their names, and whereas if I had been passing you in the corridor, I would definitely not know your names. So organizations are starting to think not just about the density, but that, like I said, the purpose of the office. And we've heard organizations saying, a few people go in a few times a week, and it's very schedule driven, but that's not really scratching the itch of employees, which is around the flexibility of when they work, not just where they work. And so we're seeing organizations saying, well, maybe it's 20% of the month should be in person, with a purpose of why you're in person, so that you're not just going there, sitting, not talking to everybody, and then having the commute to go home. So there's much more thought going into, where you can be most productive, and why you would be going into the office, and what the purpose of the office of the future is going to be.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. And as a matter of fact, a good friend of mine who's a high-end program manager for a big aerospace company was just telling me that, she has a home in the mountains, and she was working up there and then coming down. Well, the office decided 100% back in the office. And so she's going into the office and sitting on Zoom meetings in her cubicle, and she's just, she's probably going to quit, because she was so used to doing it this way, and she's a high-end responsible, some people need to be part of a team and be involved and physical. So I think it's really changed, like you said early on, it's changed the empowerment of the employees it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, and the companies that can be flexible and come up with these hybrid designs are going to really have an advantage over I know people are looking for jobs and they're asking what's your flexible work schedule. And I had that my whole life at HP. That was just how we worked, you know, but now it's become really important. So I thought maybe what we could do is in the chat. So Amanda, you had a really good question about employee health and climate action. Can you elaborate on your question, and then we'll have the folks here make comments?
Sure, Kim, thank you. And thank you very much. A few minutes ago, this was brought up as a topic, is the danger of looking at, no matter how important the issue is, but in a siloed fashion. And so I think the question that was brought up is, there are climate considerations to some of the other choices we make. How do we weigh those? How do we make sure that as board directors, we're receiving this information from management, but then we're looking at it holistically, and so we can evaluate those trade-offs? Is there a way to ensure that we don't have individual isolated committees making the decisions or having management make it in a siloed? I would just love some thoughts on how we should proceed against that.
I'd also love to hear if there's a study that you would cite, a credible study around the considerations of ESG, climate, so forth. We've demonstrated over now more than a year that we can do this remotely. Why is this even a discussion? Why aren't we saying, you know, my wife and I took a trip to Hawaii not so long ago, and it was interesting because the folks there said, you know, it was great last year. It was so nice and quiet. We saw more animals. We saw more, you know, everything was clean. It was very nice. What would the effect of that be if we all just made the decision that, hey, you know what, for knowledge workers, people in offices, you can do this remotely? Is there a study you would cite that has looked at that and is considering whether there should be a tax for returning to the office, if you will? Consider the cost, the real estate cost, the operations costs, all the things that you could save there.
Yeah, so two great comments tying into climate, and I'll tie it into buildings and workspaces. So the short answer to the second question, I don't know of a great study that does that yet. I think it's coming because of the different, well, we've seen already, for example, studies starting to show the better air quality when fewer people are commuting. So those kind of studies are out there, and that ties into climate, ties into air pollution, ties into better health. So those kind of studies are coming. I haven't seen it tied directly into real estate footprint, but I think it's there. And to Amanda's comment and related on, you know, how to think about the ESG responsibilities in the context of COVID and what else is coming in real estate portfolios, I will say this: we've done several studies here that are related to buildings and climate. Buildings consume 40% of global energy. And we put out a study a couple months ago, I think surprised a lot of people, that as the grid has gotten cleaner in the US in many places, a lot of coal-fired power has been driven off. The dominant adverse health effects from our energy system right now are coming from buildings, on-site fossil fuel combustion. I think that's probably surprises a lot of people, but it's important for organizations because the attention will shift from, when you think about ESG, say, oh, it's a grid problem, it's the coal-fired power plant problem. No, it's actually what's in your building. Are you burning fuel in your building that's contributing to localized health impacts? Very different from downstream. Oh, it's somewhere else where it's being combusted and released in the air. It's on site, and it becomes an equity thing. Where are these buildings sited? Who is having the health effects from the pollution emitted by your buildings? That's a really subtle shift. I don't think anybody's picked up on yet. A little bit. Our paper was just published a couple months ago, but it is going to shift in the next couple of years, the conversation and the focus on buildings. So to your point about, you know, what do we think about climate, ESG, our whole building footprint anyway, it starts to feed into that same narrative. You know, are buildings are they polluters, or can you actually have a building that's healthy, it's green, doesn't burn fossil fuels, and then has a very low carbon footprint. And the footprint then becomes about your commute and cars and things like that.
Well, in California, you know, their new mandates, the new construction actually be based on renewables only. So lots of stuff. You probably saw the ruling yesterday coming out of the administration about the amount of solar that is going to be used somehow. So this is changing very rapidly. And I think the question is, with all this new stuff coming in, how do we make sure that we are taking a holistic view of these matters? And we're looking at the trade-offs. I mean, ESG is such a broad and multifaceted topic. it's interesting as we look at how to structure that from a board role. How is this just interwoven throughout all of our conversations? Is it looked at by specific groups within the board? What would be your guidance on that?
I think you're spot on about it having to be holistic, because when it gets too siloed, you miss things. And I'll give you another specific example. When we've done this analysis, we can quantify the health damages from a building or portfolio of buildings related to fossil fuel use. And oftentimes it's people just count energy or carbon savings without the health impacts. If you don't take this big look at ESG, what are we actually trying to do? Or you're offsetting carbon in one place, but you're causing a downstream health effect somewhere else. That's a holistic problem. You think you're doing well, but you're not. I'd say look for these newer tools. Our team has a new tool coming out, for example, that lets you quantify these damages. So it's not just a little bit of hand wavy. We're doing ESG, we're working on energy efficiency, and I'm not minimizing it there, but you can actually start to quantify this and say, here's what we've done. We've benchmarked. We can use these tools to quantify the health impacts of our decisions locally and even beyond, our region. So there aren't many of those tools out there. It feels very hand wavy. You all know best in the ESG space, but it's getting to a much more quantified environment, because these tools are now available.
Sarah, you had a question about travel and being back on planes, and I was wondering if the discussion earlier addressed it, or if you had a follow-on kind of question that you had around travel and COVID.
Yeah, I think it's more, what can we expect going forward? Obviously we learned a lot from this experience in COVID and business travel. We went from a, situation where I think most of us were on planes every week. What do we foresee changes in business travel? And do we think there's going to be regulations that are going to change how quickly countries respond when they first detect, or is the detection process a lagging indicator and, sort of fruitless in terms of, really shutting down a new virus?
I might add just on the business travel. Interestingly, we did a survey. It included 16,000 employees, and one of the questions was around business travel. And for sure, people were eager to go back to business, so they missed it. But it's not I'm just going to go over there, sit in an office. But there was a desire to go back to business travel. But has that started up again? Not yet. And even today, I was reading around, the airlines preparing for another kind of slowdown because of the variant coming into play. So I think there is a desire to go back to some sort of business travel. I don't know that it's going to be the same as it was pre-pandemic, because we have learned ways of being able to be effective and productive in a virtual environment. And we know that, the cost of that is doesn't kind of balance out the needs, if that makes sense.
I think it depends somewhat on how the comfort level of various folks to be physically in a room. So I'm on 3 boards, and each of them has made a completely different decision. One has gone to half virtual and half in person, because it is handy to be in person and have the discussion. But we've also facilitated meetings with, there's I forget the brand, but there's now like a 360-degree camera that you can put on your meeting table, because if you're having a mixture of virtual and in person, what you see is this giant board table with 3 blobs at the very end. So it's not really, Zoom is actually better if everybody's on Zoom versus, this half and half thing, because then you get, I can't see the screen, I can't see you, etc. One is trying the half and half route with, like I said, not a great amount of success. And the other one hasn't decided to have anything in person yet until things are more stable. So I think it's going to be a smorgasbord of choices from now on, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the comment about the future pandemic, I think everyone pulled out their pandemic response crisis management guide when this started happening and thought maybe we need to look that over a little more carefully. And I do think that people are going to look at future pandemics and how we work and how the board comes together. It's not going to go back. It's going to be something different. And I'd be curious from other board members, here on this program, what kind of changes, because that was very interesting, Beatrice, on what you saw. My boards are very diverse. They've all been online, nothing in person, but as far as the company response and how we've managed the COVID pandemic. So one of them was a bank, and obviously the bank has to be open and there has to be people. So there was more of a stay in person kind of mentality, and then back office things that could be done remotely. Those were done, but it was very hybrid at the very beginning. Then another office that is a medical device company that manufactures here in the States and California. And that CEO did some very creative things, like doing all the grocery shopping for the employees that had to stay in the office. Every week he'd have them make a list out and just really creative type things. I keep meaning to ask him, is he still doing that? Because that was something that sometimes when you give something, it's hard to take it away. And then the other company is a very big leasing to leasing company, truck drivers building buildings, modular buildings and tanks and things like that. So there's been a whole hybrid, and there was this whole strategy about getting back in the office. Now it's like, okay, now we have to look at what's going on with the Delta virus. But I would be really curious to hear from other folks, and also the fact that in the boardroom, it's in the strategic conversations. It's like, what are we going to do to continue to manage through the pandemic and stay very whole? And what can we do in the future to help attract new employees who now have these expectations? So I'd be curious if others had interesting things going on in their board discussions. And if not, if no one wants to discuss that, think about it, because I'd love to hear it. We have a couple other questions. So let's see. David Fields, you have a question around, have you seen environmental health and safety programs in the commercial rental space? Can you elaborate on your question? Where's David? Did he leave us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, well, there you are.
Yes. So I'm sorry about that. But I am, hang on, let me mute for just a second.
We can.
The joys of remote working.
Yes, exactly.
It was kind of guess, is it going to be the dog, the phone?
Exactly, the Amazon delivery.
This is one of the downsides, I guess. But in any event, I wanted to know whether you've seen in the commercial retail office space a company whose practices around environmental and safety issues as it relates to COVID represent what you think are the best practices.
Oh, that's a good one. Let's see. And you specifically said retail and
office
space. Yeah. To be honest, I think most have not approached it in that sophisticated manner, because largely it's different from a manufacturing that has to have or healthcare that has to have a really robust EH&S program. Laboratories, universities, where commercials, I've seen most commercial organizations outsource this to companies. Periodic indoor air quality surveys. I used to do forensic investigations of sick buildings. I still do some of this. Somebody's a problem, there's a complaint, they call in a consultant, environmental health or engineering company. And I think most commercial landlords, or commercial real estate companies, that's how they're doing it. Because it hasn't been, you had to have someone on site testing fume hoods and PPE and all this stuff. And that's where I think some of the risk comes for some of these companies, because they don't have the infrastructure necessarily in place or the expertise in-house to deal with these new kind of issues, right? So, a lot of these, even COVID protocols, went to facilities managers or sustainability who don't always have training in health. Next thing you know, they're writing up COVID protocols for the building. And now they're essentially performing the EH&S role outside of, periodic indoor air quality sampling, which they know. So I think that's some of the challenge for them, because they haven't had to do it really. They've done energy, but really haven't had to do really robust, I guess, environmental health and safety, where they're not sitting on real-time data coming in. Traditionally, right, maybe once a year, and this mostly doesn't even happen. You hire a firm, they go out, collect the water sample, collect an air sample, it goes to the lab, you get a nice report on your desk. Somebody glances at it, you're done with IAQ, just check the box. That's changing with the real-time data. And this is really important for boards to know about what's changing. A lot of these companies are rewriting the terms of their lease around indoor air quality. Where it used to be a check the box once a year, yeah, we take a water sample, everything's good. And now they're like, that's not sufficient anymore. So I've seen a lot of companies rewriting the terms here to look for more robust, testing and verification of the air quality and things like that. That's been a big change. That's all in the past, 6 months.
Dottie had a question around vaccine mandates, and I have to think that 2 years ago, I don't think any of us as board directors would have ever thought that we would be discussing people's personal vaccine decisions or whether it's going to be mandated. And I don't know, Dottie, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on your question, but boy, oh boy, this is an interesting one. It's come up in the last board meeting I had with one of my boards about, what's happening with vaccines, and it's a very interesting topic. So Dottie, did you want to elaborate a little bit on any of your insights or opinions on that, or what you're looking for?
Sure. One of the companies where I'm on the board, which is a fairly large employer, is, seriously considering making a vaccine mandate. And there is considerable pushback, and there may be some long-term valued employees that they lose because of this, which, if you're in the vaccine camp, is just like, how can you be so clueless? But recognizing that, you're dealing with a large and diverse workforce, and people have different opinions and are in different parts of the country. So I'm just interested if others have a view on this. I think we're probably just going to go there because we deal with the public. We can't afford to, the liability, if you will, of not presenting the safest possible face to the public. But it is, first of all, it's just a conundrum why people, refuse the vaccine. But, just how do you handle that in general? I'm just curious if others have experience with it.
Hey, Dottie, Stephen here. Maybe just jumping in on that. So at smaller companies, it's been a lot easier to just make it happen, and doing it has definitely pushed multiple employees who have not been vaccinated to get vaccinated with relatively little fuss. And we couched it in terms of safety of the communities in which we are in, safety of the rest of the employees, and just frankly brings down our liability dramatically. And there'll be noise. Some of the larger firms on whose boards I sit have been more challenged because they're worried about losing long-term employees. And I've taken a pretty hard line on that, which is, I understand that concern, but the flip side to that is you won't be able to return to normalcy in the office for a very long time. And I do not think that other incentives, whether they're carrots or sticks, are working at all to change people's behavior.
But I'm curious how you are verifying that. Is that employee attestation, or are you actually verifying vaccine cards?
We used our HR system to send out a signature form to every employee. We have part of our team that actually does have a health component to it, and there we did ask to see the cards, but for the larger employee base, it was too complicated to do, and the APIs to get people's access are too painful. So we required attestation, and then we hope that people have told the truth. I think what will wind up happening is if someone really wants to flaunt the law, they not only won't sign the form, like I didn't do it, they'll make an issue of it up front versus lying about it.
Just a kind of an interesting sideline to that, I sing in a community chorus, and we've decided we're going to start rehearsing in person if certain metrics are met, which we just learned are really not the right metrics, but they're the only metrics that we have at the moment, like rate of transmission. And we are requiring all members to upload to the member website proof of vaccination. So you can't come if you're not vaccinated, and you have to sign a waiver, and you have to get a negative test, 72 hours before the dress rehearsal and things like that. But we are actually requiring proof of vaccination. As is, if you attend the theater or anything else in the Bay Area, you're required to show it.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting time in our society, that's for sure. It's really is. We could go on for a long time with this. Vivek, why don't you elaborate on your question regarding labor arbitrage? I think this is interesting.
Certainly. I'm not talking about outsourcing or offshoring in this context as much, although that is going to come up eventually from shareholder value perspective. But right now, emerging markets are struggling, so the labor arbitrage isn't across the pond. But if it is already decoupled and the trend is going to be here, to stay for tech companies, for other non-public facing businesses, is there more discussion that you guys are having in terms of tech situations as people move out of the locale, out of the country, etc.?
Here, I'll give you some insight there. We have decided on staying with remote, and as such, we've had recent discussions around geographic limitations of where people can and can't live because we have privacy concerns with respect to cross-border transfers of data and things of that nature. So that has played into our business, but I don't know that it would play into many others who might not have that concern. The other side of it is the HIPAA concerns around the collection, on the last question, on the collection of the vaccination information. But for employees, you can live wherever you like as long as it's within the US.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we've had interesting, one of the boards that I'm on, we've actually had difficulty attracting talent. In the Bay Area, it's very competitive. And the fact that we can now bring people on that don't have to be physically there has really changed the way we look at certain positions. And it's a pretty old school kind of environment where everybody came to the office. So it's shifting pretty fast. And I think that's one of the side benefits.
And one of the things that we've definitely seen is organizations, when they said you could work from anywhere, were then challenged with it. Well, actually, you can't work from anywhere because we need to have the right to work in, even in the States, right? The right to work in every state, or have an entity in another country. And then there's the payroll issues and the tax issues and all of those things. So, now, yes, organizations are looking to provide some sort of flexibility, but they also recognize there's some risk to the individual and the organization that they need to manage. So they're kind of slightly backtracking on some of that.
Yeah. Some people are requiring that when you're in the meeting, you have to be on the video. I was involved in a company a while back that this one employee just would never come on the video. And so there was all the scuttlebutt about what's going on, and found out he was basically skiing all day. And he didn't want to be on the video because it would be pretty obvious that, he had the goggle thing or whatever. And I mean, those are important situations because people will take advantage in some cases. And so having some structure around how you meet. But anyways, I thought that was interesting that it actually came up to the boardroom, that we were having this discussion about people not engaging. I think there was a period of time at the beginning of the pandemic when people took the shelter in place as a big shutdown of everything. And then it was like, no, we have to keep moving. And some people got into some bad habits. But anyways, very interesting to hear these discussions at the boardroom. Let's see, what else do we have here?
Kim, real quick, I'm going to add one more thing on this idea that Vivek raised about salary arbitrage. And we also saw that letting people, quote, work from anywhere created unbelievable org overhead problems. Everything from how do you get people equipment and the right to work and go to different countries. So we started to have to backtrack on that as well. And then there's this question I think Vivek got at very directly, which is, do you adjust people's salaries based on where they live? And it is very hard to take someone's salary down if they move away, especially in the tech space. I don't think that salary arbitrage is going to last very long, especially if you're an individual who can go sell your services to any company in the world, where regardless of where you live, you're going to get paid US rates. So I think, unfortunately, that arbitrage in tech is really not going to exist. Google's trying to put it back in. If Google succeeds in their attempts to change the salary structure, that may help some of the bigger companies, but then smaller companies will just use their latest round of funding to boost salaries back up. So I think, unfortunately, lower cost of living is going to be really hard to make stick in even the near term.
Actually, you bring up a really interesting point, and I know friends of mine who have millennials working in the city, and one of them wanted to move out of the country, and he's paying someone to have an address, to use their address in the city to keep his salary the same. And so I think there's a lot of that going on as well that has to be sorted out. And these people are creative and clever, and but it isn't, we got to do what's fair to the company too. So it's, like I said, an interesting time that we live in, and interesting discussions at the boardroom. And I know we're going to be running out of time here, so I'm trying to look through. Let's see, Vivek, you had another question. Wait, here we go. Tim, Delta. Oh, you had made a comment about Delta Airlines requiring non-vaccinated employees. Yeah, I have a friend who's I have a friend who works there, so that's been a very interesting one as well. So this question about the healthcare costing more if you're not vaccinated. So it looks like your question is, will this become a common means of encouraging vaccines? Tim?
Yep.
Similar to smokers surcharge, health plans already have that. So is there a surcharge for the unvaccinated?
There's some movement here for sure. Some organizations are doing it and putting a penalty on this, or taking a fee, or requiring people to pay for their own testing. And I'll just mention a New York Times op-ed. I was on a TV show with a woman who writes for Kaiser Permanente, and they're moving in that direction. She wrote an op-ed in the Times talking about this. So I think it'll come, and it'll be driven by the insurers, and then it'll be handed down to the businesses, these premiums or surcharges. You see the airlines have moved, some of the airlines have moved that way already. I think the vaccine mandates is coming, a lot of it. So a lot of companies moved early, and the big ones went, Google, Facebook, big financial firms all went this way early. And now that the vaccine is fully approved, many other companies jumped on board here. You saw the announcement that leaked out about Biden's announcement today. They're requiring all federal employees. He did it for the military already. I think we'll see a lot more of it. And what it means for some companies, I think it depends on your company. If you're already 95%, 96% vaccinated, that extra bump you're going to get in terms of protecting is going to be low. But for a lot of these organizations, it's a big deal. Fire department and police, 50% vaccinated. Healthcare workers, some are 40 or 6 to 60% vaccinated. That's just dangerous and irresponsible. So I think collectively, the vaccine mandates make a lot of sense. I think for different organizations, it gets a lot more nuanced fast.
Rob, you had a question, I think is a really interesting one regarding international. If someone's vaccinated in one country, does it apply to another country? Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so, many of us either are part of or sit on boards of international companies. And there are different vaccines have been developed in China, Russia, EU. Only some have been authorized in the US. China's only authorized their vaccines. So what do as we start to resume international air travel? And how do we do mandates internationally? It seems we've been talking a lot about the US companies, mandates here in the United States. But how do we take an international view on this? And the efficacy rates are different for all these vaccines. FDA has not done anything on the Chinese or Russian vaccines, looked at that data. So what do we do if we put these vaccine mandates in place for international firms?
So I give you some guidance here where I am at Harvard, same issue. We have a lot of international students, and what we've decided is WHO approved vaccines. And that's what so it's not just US approved. We have students coming from all over the world. If you come from somewhere, part of the world that doesn't have one of these approved vaccines, we offer you a US approved vaccine, as soon as you land.
Okay.
So I know we're going to be out of time here. I'm looking at, there's quite a few comments, and I want to get to a few more of these. And I think, Amy, you had a comment about, has anyone implemented automatic periodic deletion of vaccination status in order to minimize holding data? And then I want to go to Kelly next and see what other comments from her chat post. So Amy, did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to, because from a data privacy perspective, companies want to minimize holding any type of personal and healthcare data. And with vaccine confirmations, especially because we're asking for that data around a lot of events. So I'm just wondering if anyone's dealt with having a systemic way of, once you've received the confirmation and the event passed, then there's no reason to hold that particular piece of data. And it's easy to just do another round of confirmation if the person is coming on site again for another event. And so I'm just wondering if anyone's handled that and done it in a methodical and automated way.
It's a good question.
That's in my space, so I'll speak. But how do I say this? The challenge we are talking about immediately deleting the information. However, that is toothless, and the reason it's toothless is because by virtue of you being there, you've already demonstrated that you've satisfied the requirement. Therefore, the status is confirmed for employees, for visitors, and folks like that. We've not broached that. That's a big challenging thing. How do you mandate vaccination for a visitor to your office, and be comfortable with that in a way that's viable? But for employees, you can, we chose to save the information as long as HIPAA requirements or in alignment with HIPAA requirements, and to delete the information in accordance with that retention policy. However, the thing that we struggle with is subsequent vaccinations. Do you have to go back and get boosters, and how often do you require these checks and so forth? This stuff is uncharted territory here, and there's nothing definitive, and as a result, it's a moving goalpost today. So I don't know that we have a good answer, or I have a good answer for you, but that's how we're handling the vaccination information. We're treating it no different than we would any other private HIPAA information for employees.
Okay, well, as we wrap up here, Kelly, I think I'd love to hear from you. You have some words of caution, and I'd be curious if you had these discussions in the boardroom and kind of how they went.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So the first thing, right, is the that I put in there was the issue about the penalty on insurance for unvaccinated people, right? And there's been a lot of discussion around this, not as much in the boardroom, but because again, insurance companies are going to do it. But I think one thing we have to be careful of is, how do you not bring in other underlying conditions such as obesity? People that are doing stuff purposely. From, you're going to start having now a BMI index and adjusting your rates based on BMI index. It's really no different. So again, just for discussion, I'm not saying it's right, wrong, or otherwise, but these are things that we have to think about. But the biggest thing that I'm seeing across here, and I'm seeing it on the insurance side and everything else in the guidance, is nobody's taken into account natural immunity. Right. And you should really look at George Mason University. One of the professors won at the state Supreme Court level, because the studies are out there that if you have the natural immunity and you get the COVID vaccine, your risks of side effects go up by like 200 or 300%. So as a board member and as you're mandating this, we just need to keep into account the fact that we don't have a lot of data on that. And it doesn't mean that you don't do it, but just be super careful on what you're asking for, because nobody's taken into account natural immunity. I think, and I personally think it's wrong, because natural immunity is better than other immunities. So, it's just something to be thinking of, and make sure that you're looking at current case law that's happening and being super careful not to back yourself into a corner. Because if you start mandating and stuff starts happening, you're going to be liable.
Let me jump in here on that, because I want to correct some of that. think that not all of that is quite factual, to be totally blunt about it. The risk, if you're vaccinated, if you have natural infection and get vaccinated, is not extraordinarily high. In fact, the risks from the vaccines are extraordinarily low. They are safe. It's one of the most studied vaccines in the history of medicine and scrutinized by every scientist around the world. I will say this, you're correct in that natural infection needs to be taken account of. If you want to know the best protection, if you've been infected, natural infection plus one shot is the best protection you can get. That is perfectly safe to do. Next best is the 2 shots. And a mix and match even looks like it will be okay, although not formally approved. So let's be clear, the vaccines are 100% safe. I think it's 100%. As safe can be. Impeccable safety record. Hundreds of millions of people have had these doses. We can detect incidents on the order of 1 in a million, extremely rare, and we're not detecting them. Extremely safe vaccines. I've never heard that before, that if you are infected and you get a vaccine, you're at high risk. That is not true.
The data's out there. I just think you just need to just be smart about it, right? That's all I'm saying. This is still so new. There's a lot of things, and underlying conditions. There's a big one that just came out about RA. I've got some really good friends that have RA, and their doctors are basically saying they don't recommend it if you have RA, and their company denied that request coming from a doctor. So she's going to get fired because her doctor is saying that her risks with RA are greater than the safety from the shot, and the company's firing her.
All right. Well, I don't know about everyone else, but I've really gotten a lot about, I appreciate all the comments. I appreciate all the insights from the boardroom, and Sarah and Dr. Allen. Really great conversation. I think this is an interesting topic, and certainly a slippery slope in certain cases, in certain ways, but one that definitely needs to be addressed, and strategies need to be formed. So I really appreciate everyone coming. And again, thank you to Ernst & Young for sponsoring us. Please fill out the survey that will be posted in the chat room. That's how we know how to improve, and where we're doing things well, and where we need to look and see how we're supplying these programs to all of you. So have a great day, and thank you very much for attending.